Clear to engage. Time on target. 5 mics. Out.
Oh, that's all right. Well, Reagan texted and he's sick, so he's not feeling up to using his voice. So we're not going to get a bunch of Reagan questions. So it's just going to be you and me, Dave.
Okay.
Sam bailed on you, so we can get total tinfoil hat today. Then I guess so we can go
All right.
full on and try to figure out housing. Let me first. We were just joking before about housing. I mean, I'm here with Dave Hunnicutt, everybody that's listening. Dave Hunnicutt's Oregon Property Owners Association. Home builders too, maybe? No, probably not. I don't know. You're
No,
like every
no.
you've done everything though. So when it comes to land, just OPOA though, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of developer and home builder members. In fact, our mission, Brian, is to represent property owners across Oregon. So we have everybody: farmers, ranchers, realtors, developers, home builders. We count them all in our association and do our best to try and take care of the needs of all Oregon property owners.
It sure seems like, and I've had some conversations with some of your members over the years where, they'll the court, this is a, correct me if I'm wrong, you a consortium of guys, somebody says, "Hey, let's put $2 million together and let's go buy this tract of land and then we're going to develop it." And then somebody says that's a great idea, and then they run into land use problems, and so they end up at your desk at some point, and you go, "Oh, why did you buy there?" and then and then you try to help them figure it out, right? I mean, that seems to be the few guys that I've ran, and then of course they come to the legislature to say, "Hey, we need some help," or they say, "Hey, how do we get more Republicans elected? Because you guys are going to help us with this." That tends to be my history with Oregon property owners and you especially before the last few sessions working on housing together. But there
A
seems
lot.
to be a lot of people in that world of buying property before they actually know what they can do with it.
Yeah, we have a lot of that. I laugh. I get calls a couple times a year from people out of state saying, "Hey, I want to come up there and develop." And so there's this 200-acre property that I want to buy and I want to subdivide it. And these are usually people that actually it can come from any of the 49 other states. But I tell them, look, okay, here's what's going on here's how that works in Oregon, and inevitably, since they have capital that they're willing to put at risk and they can go anywhere and invest their capital, they end up walking away from projects here and going into another state where you could actually accomplish something in a reasonable amount of time. But for every one of those, Brian, we also have folks that call, what they used to call them around the Capitol, Hunnicutt's little old widows, because, these are people that have owned property in Oregon for 50, 60 years, sometimes through generations. It's been in family hands for over a century, and get caught up in rules and statutes that were never designed to impact them. A great example was in 2024. We got a call from a family in Multnomah County, just almost to the Columbia County line, whose house had burned in August of 2023. Electrical fire burned down their house. They lost their daughter and their two grandkids in the fire. And all they wanted to do was replace their home in the exact same spot. And Multnomah County was telling them that they weren't going, the Oregon land use laws wouldn't allow them to put their house back. And at a time, when that family is at its all-time low, it's just a devastating impact to lose a child and grandkids. These people are at their all-time low to have a county go in, and you can't really blame the county. They were, although Multnomah County deserves a lot of blame for a lot of different things. This wasn't their issue. This was an issue of state law that impacted this family and was preventing this family from putting their house back up. And it's just it's situations like that where you say, okay, why do we have the system the way we have it, and why isn't there a way that in situations like this that we can't help these people get back on their feet without torturing them and making them go through essentially a 2 or 3 year process just to put their house back.
Wow. So, yeah, it's horrible. Why? So give me, do you have like the Dave Hunnicutt, like 5 minute, for the listeners that maybe don't understand? I mean, I think everybody here tertiarily understands land use, but maybe like fast forward it a little bit to why we have what we have today. Is
Yeah.
there some key landmark things that have happened over the last 30 years that have really gotten us to where we are today? Or is it really back to 73?
Well, it really starts back in '73 when the legislature passed Senate Bill 100, which created a statewide system. And unlike the other 49 states, in Oregon, we have a single state agency. The commission is the Land Conservation and Development Commission, the LCDC. The legislature created that agency and basically put that agency in charge of creating a statewide planning system that applies to all 36 counties in every Oregon city in Oregon, and requires every Oregon city and county to comply with essentially state mandates. In most, in fact, in all the other states, zoning is really a local government issue. So that if you don't like the way the city, if the city that you're living in you think is growing too much or not growing fast enough, you can move to another town where people that think like where you have a city council of people that think more like you. In Oregon, we can't do that because every city is essentially, and county is limited by whatever the state says that they can do. And the problem, of course, with that is over the years, as we've had a series of progressive governors, that agency has essentially enacted a series of really stringent regulations that make it basically hard to do anything, hard to build houses, hard to build factories, hard to do any kind of commercial or industrial development. And so Oregon, it continues to fall behind in terms of job growth and employment, as well as housing. And so we end up, when you have more people that need housing than you have available housing, then the prices go up. And we can lay a lot of that, not all of it, but we can lay a lot of that at the blame for that at the feet of LCDC, along with our state legislator and our past governors.
Is that so? Obviously, philosophically, right? But how can you be? Is it just control, or is it philosophically just this desire that you just don't want to build homes? Like I still struggle with this one. Because how could you philosophically be not want to build homes? That doesn't make any sense to me. Like I don't, and then to have an agency creating rules and doing work that literally is counterproductive I can get the idea of not wanting to have, 1 acre homes like in neighborhoods, right? These huge, massive neighborhoods. But can you explain that? Like, what is your thought of that?
Well, and it's actually two LCDC, again, the state agency. They have 19 statewide planning goals. And they range from goal one, which is citizen involvement, to goal 10, which is housing.
Mm-hmm.
Goals 9 and 10 are the economic development and housing goals. And again, every city and county in Oregon is supposed to comply with the housing goal and the economic development goal, and the citizen involvement goal, and all of the other statewide goals they're required to comply with, assuming that the goal applies to them. There's a couple of coastal goals, for example, that wouldn't apply in Burns, but obviously apply in Lincoln City. And so just because we have 19 statewide planning goals doesn't mean that they're supposed to all be equal, but they're not.
Hmm.
Our state has really focused almost exclusively on goal 3 and 4. Goal 3 is the ag lands goal, and goal 4 is the forest lands goal. So and they've really completely ignored goals 9 and 10. We're really not interested in this at the state level. The state agencies really aren't interested at all in housing or economic development. They're really interested in saving farmland and forest land, and they're really interested in citizen involvement. And so the focus of the state, and frankly, the legislature, at least the last few years, the focus has been, okay, how do we maybe allow for a little bit of housing, maybe, but only if it doesn't, if we save farmland. And how do we allow for maybe a little bit of economic, industrial, and commercial development? Maybe, but only if it doesn't impact farmland. And so when your focus is entirely on one goal and not the other 18, or two, farm and forest,
Mhm.
and not the rest of the goals, then you really hamstring your ability to get anything done and to do what Oregonians really need: housing and jobs. And we're not very good at that in this state. And our land use system really is a large part of the reason that we're not very good at it. And the what's happened the last couple of sessions with the majority party really sort of highlights the internal conflict that they're having on these very issues.
Well, and I'm all for the altruistic, mentality and philosophy, because I mean, we obviously working in this building, you deal with a lot of people that are, that's just they're activists, right? Like their whole goal is one thing. They don't care about anything else. But with this group, Thousand Friends, Land Watch, all these kind of groups that are just so anti-housing on any level, but they're not altruistic, because all of a sudden you get an intel that pops up in the probably the best farmland that's ever existed on the face of the earth in Hillsborough. And all of a sudden they're not there picketing them and doing all the things. So I just find it like they care about goals 1 and 4 and 5 until something comes along that maybe is a shinier penny for a minute, or do they just set those aside because they know they have to give in sometime somewhere some things? It just seems
No,
odd to me. The
well, let's correct a misconception, Brian. You talked about the land out west of north and west of Hillsborough is the best farmland ever. Every state will tell you that their state has the best farmland ever created. And so, if we're talking about actual food production, then maybe we ought to go talk to Iowa and Kansas, and and the
fair.
West states, where they really produce the crops that feed, and not just America but the world. Oregon is more of a specialty farm state, as opposed to the nation's leading agricultural producer. That's not a slight in any way about Oregon's farmers. We represent a ton of Oregon farmers, and we love Oregon farmers. It's just to correct the misconception that if we convert 400 acres of farmland northwest of Hillsborough into a microchip facility that generates billions of dollars in jobs and revenue, and also improves our national security so that we're not solely reliant on Taiwan to produce our most advanced microchips, when Taiwan is under essentially a direct threat from mainland China to be overtaken. Then we need to correct those misconceptions. But really what's going on here, and there's been a ton of really interesting articles. I don't know if you ever look at the Atlantic magazine, but the Atlantic spends 99 out of every 100 articles bashing Donald J. Trump. But the other one out of 100 articles they write when they're not bashing Trump talks about our need for housing and jobs across the country, not just Oregon, across the country. And there was a really interesting article in late last month entitled "The Coming Democratic Civil War." And really what it focuses on is a schism in the Democratic Party between those, and you could see this play out exactly on this issue as we've experienced it over the years at the state legislature, between those who care more about producing results, in this case, building more housing, versus those who are more concerned with the process and making sure that everybody gets a chance to say whatever they want, and we have to go through endless hearings and endless citizen involvement and endless public process, and which essentially means endless ways to kill a project. Those battles are ongoing, not just in Oregon, but across the country and in Congress. And it's really heightened after the last elections, where the Democratic Party took a pretty significant beatdown, and so as the left struggles to try and figure out its way, and how they connect back with average Americans, they find themselves in an internal struggle between their progressive advocacy groups who want to kill projects, and the American public who have, somebody like me that has 4 kids in their 20s that wants all their kids at some point to live the American dream and buy a house, but they can't because the average house is $600,000 or $700,000, and we got 6 or 7% mortgage interest rates. So it's a schism that they're fighting, and we see that play out on the housing agenda in the Oregon legislature as well.
So, and I know that definitely plays out here for sure, but we have some Republicans that, farmers and stuff, right? Going back to your farmland thing real quick, like you're right, and thanks for correcting me that every state thinks that they have the best, California will say their Mid-Valley is the best, producing area in the world, and we got to do everything we can to protect it because it's, otherwise we'd have no lettuce or whatever it is that they grow, and potatoes in Idaho, apparently in Oregon too. I didn't realize we were such a potato, but I guess grapes in Washington. Yeah, it's a good point to make that there is always, every state thinks they're the best at growing something.
Yeah. Well, every state's proud of their farmers, and they should be. Farmers are good people, and the industry is a good industry, and we ought to do what we can to protect that. Our position, Brian, has always been that saving farmland shouldn't be the issue. That's the issue. That's the issue that the left wants to paint. We're going to save farmland. Our position has always been we want to save farmers. You don't have farmland unless you have a farmer. And so to the extent that the left wants to use rules to limit what a farmer can do, the end result, as we see from the ag census that's produced every 5 years from the federal government, the end result is not just in Oregon, but across the country, we're losing farmers.
Yeah.
Because a farmer's no different than a home builder or a factory owner or whatever. If a project doesn't pencil, if they can't make any money, they're not going to farm. And so you don't encourage farmers to farm if you regulate them to the point through land use restrictions, if you them to the point where they can't have, the public come out to their farm and have a pumpkin patch and sell pumpkins and apple cider and have a corn maze and things like that. If you're gonna basically regulate a farmer to the point where they can only do one thing, which is run their tractor up and down the rows and sell their crop wholesale to whoever will bid on it, then we're going to lose farmers. We're not losing farmland. We're losing farmers, and that for us, that's bad. That's not a good thing. That's bad.
Yeah, what do you make of that? I think even the Senate Republicans put it out there. We've lost like 220,000 acres of farmland or something. Like, I don't think that's the case, right? I mean, I felt that was a little disingenuous, even from our own party, actually. I was like, what are you guys doing? That's not what I've heard.
Well, it's just flat out wrong is the problem. We have in 1986 was the year the law was passed. The Senate Bill 100 was passed in 73. By 1986, every county in Oregon had complied with Senate Bill 100, and
Hmm.
they zoned basically all of their rural land. Once you get outside of town in Oregon, 97% of all the rural, privately owned rural land is zoned for farm or forest use. So once you get out of town, if you look around, if it's privately owned, not owned by most of the, or over half of Oregon is owned by the federal government. But if you look at the privately owned land outside of town, 97 out of every 100 acres of that private land is going to be zoned as farm or forest land. So it's basically all of it.
Yeah.
Uh, but what you find when you go out there is over 99% of the land that was originally zoned in 1986 as farmland is still zoned farmland. We're
Mm,
not the 600,000 acres, and they're relying on the ag census for that. But that measures farmland loss in an entirely different way. And in fact, out of that 600,000 acres that they're talking about, 400,000 of it is in Wasco County alone. So 2/3 of it is in Wasco County, and we had the Wasco County planner in Senator Golden's committee the other day saying, yeah, I don't know where they come up with that number. It's just entirely wrong. And so I have to acknowledge, Brian, I was a little frustrated by that post too, because that number has been dispelled, and it's just flat out wrong. We aren't losing farmland in this state. Again, we're losing farmers. We're not losing
yeah.
farmland.
Because I've heard you say, and I think you've even said this publicly, maybe it was in a hearing. I heard you say, what was it, since 1973, we've only lost less than 1% of the farmland that was allocated in 73 or something, or that
Well,
has become
yeah, it's 86, and we've
or
we've
86. Okay.
lost less than 1%, and about 40,000 of those acres, and I know that may sound like a lot uh, to your listeners, but remember, we have 61 million acres of land in Oregon, and 55% of that's owned by state, federal, local governments, predominantly federal. The feds
Yeah.
own most of the land in Oregon, or over half of it. Out of that remaining private land, we have 24 million of acres of that land in farm and
Mm.
forest, and we've lost 40,000 acres. And that's 40,000 acres over the last 40 years, and most of that has gone to urban growth boundary expansions. The cities have
Yeah.
grown. We've lost about 40,000 acres, but that those UGB expansions and not even closely compared to the amount of growth we've had in this state over the last 40 years. We are expanding our urban growth boundaries at a far slower rate than we're growing, and so we haven't been able to accommodate all the people that have moved here, and which is why we find ourselves in a housing shortage. We're just not keeping up, but it isn't the result of the fact that we're losing farmland. I mean, at the rate we're going, Brian, we will run out of farmland in Oregon in about 15,000 years. How many human evolutions we will go through over the next 15,000 years,
Yeah, right.
I can't tell you, but I mean, we are not under any threat in Oregon of loss of farmland, and anybody who tells you otherwise, you need to go grab a bucket of water because their pants are on fire.
Yeah, because the 3% you talked about before that is around cities. So basically, you take all the UGBs around every town, group them together, and it's like 3% of the state.
It's not even 3%, Brian, because we have about we have about 2% of the privately owned land in this state is zoned for rural residential, rural commercial, rural industrial.
Okay.
It's rural home sites, and some old rural mill sites and things like that. We inside urban growth boundaries, which are the magic line on the map that designates where urban development is supposed to go, cities basically, from where rural areas are supposed to be, it's farming and forest basically. Uh, we have a little over 1% of Oregon of Oregon land is within urban growth boundaries. So we house 90% of our state's population on less than 1%, or just a little bit over 1% of the state's land. Uh, and there are still people that say that's sprawl. And it's once you know the numbers, you realize how ridiculous their arguments are. But now, this just becomes a question of how can we communicate this to the public to get the average citizen to understand that we're not losing farmland, we're under no risk of of running out of land, and because we've shorted ourselves any kind of reasonable amount of land to build houses and jobs, we've basically really hurt ourselves, and we've done it to ourselves, and we've created housing prices that are the least unaffordable in the United States. The city of Portland, they just did a national study was just published a couple of weeks ago, Brian, that showed that the city of Portland, despite all of its flaws, still has the absolute least affordable housing market in the United States, given wages versus
Yeah.
the cost of a home. And that translates into the inability of your kids and my kids and people's grandkids. And, we're losing generations of young Oregonians that would like to stay here and start a family and create a business that are moving to other states because they can't afford to buy a house here or
Yeah.
rent.
Or the worst, especially for the Portland area, the worst what we're seeing. I remember some of those presentations that they did during in the housing is, and actually one I think was in business and labor, where the guy from Eco Northwest, I forget his name, but he did basically call it Portland's doom loop.
Yeah.
And the only blip that he saw that was a positive was in Washington, in Clark County. So everybody that can is moving to Washington, and they're buying. So Washington is basically benefiting from Portland's horrible or Oregon's horrible housing policies and is shoving people across the bridge, which is exacerbating the traffic problem, which is exacerbating all the other things. But Washington's getting all that tax base, and we're not getting that tax base. So the people that have means are moving across the river, you know.
Well, this is not just an Oregon issue. It's really a West Coast issue. I mean, we have our legislature has a way of seeing what's going on to their neighbor to the north and their neighbor to the south and thinking, oh, that's a really good idea. And then we go do some of the same dumb things that they've done in California and Washington. The only problem with Oregon, and why we shouldn't be emulating our fellow West Coast states to the north and south, is that they have economic development features and geographical features that we don't have here. In
Mm,
Washington, they have ports, they have a military presence. In California, they have one of the largest ports in the world. They have a significantly sized population. They have all kinds of Fortune 500 and economic development, companies
yeah.
and economic development opportunities. We have Nike and Intel, and that's it. And no one has to develop in Oregon. And so if we're going to adopt Washington's regulatory model and California's tax model, and expect somebody that comes up from out of state that has capital to invest to come here and invest in Oregon for whatever reason, why would they do that?
Yeah, I don't know why. It's a
I
really
don't
good
know why
question.
either, and it's frustrating that we can't get some kind of bipartisan package where, rather than focusing on public process and citizen involvement, and giving everybody a chance to say whatever they want, and torturing and stopping sprawl and saving farmland and all the
Yeah.
reasons that we can't do anything, why we don't have an economic development model that says, okay, we can do all of those things, but we're going to do it in a way that still encourages someone from Texas or California, or pick your bigger state, to come in here and risk capital on and create jobs and development in this state. We don't do that very well. And it's an attitude we have in this state, and at some point, it already is biting us in the butt, but at some point it's going to get really bad, and I think it needs to get
Yeah.
worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I think the doom loop is, it would take decades for us to come out of that if we fall, and we're pretty close to it, I think, a circle
Mhm.
in the drain, as they say. That looking at, and I was just pulled this up, and I was looking at the building permits for new single family construction in Oregon and kind of looking at your historical, obviously the high water mark was, what, end of '05, right? Somewhere right in there, '06. That seems that we're about 25,000 single family construction. If you add apartments on top of that, we actually did more apartments back in the '90s. But it looks like we were moving to, and so we did another, 10, 12,000. So what, 37,000, nearly 40,000 building permits, roughly at the high water mark. And then, of course, we had the Great Recession, which just everything just dumped. And it looked like we were, I think crawling out of it, but definitely at a slower pace. And then you look at, and you know these numbers, so I don't have to show you the graphs, but then you see like mid 2015, maybe even more like 2013, when if you look at the national numbers, like all of a sudden they started spiking nationally. And we just kind of stayed on this little bumpy road. And then there was a nice little blip with COVID, right? Where everybody was stuck in their home and then they moved them. And then literally right after that little blip we've had, we just have cratered.
Mhm.
And the rest of the US obviously went down a little bit, but that hadn't to do with building permits. That had to do with more just, too much glut in the market, right? So there was just a little bit of burn off there. Do you So the has land use didn't really change. I guess what my question is like in '05, were we building, was there just enough land? Were the prices still cheap enough? Were things still in a way that developers were bombing away at the market, and then everything cratered? And then what happened in maybe the last 10, 12 years? Has there been anything that we can look at that is it really just that philosophy that DLCD just said no, we're just going to slow roll this thing?
Yeah, it's really, and the timing of that is exactly right, Brian, because I remember back in probably starting in the 2011 session, maybe nine, somewhere. Yeah, probably the 11 because we were coming out of that of the
Hmm.
mortgage crisis. Uh, John Chandler, who was the lobbyist for the home builders, and I were were appearing in front of every legislative committee that wanted to talk about this issue and say, look, we are having a problem with both the process that both cities and the state has created to get a project completed, whether that's a housing project or an industrial project or a commercial project, it doesn't matter. It's the same. Our land use process is broken, and we've shorted ourselves. We have an artificial shortage of land to develop, and so it's causing prices to skyrocket. And so until we fix our issues with process and land supply, we're going to have a housing shortage, and that housing shortage is going to get worse because, and to her credit, Governor Kotek, then Representative Kotek, and later Speaker Kotek, was the first one one of the first ones on in the majority party to understand this issue and say, look, I agree with you. I know it's not popular in my party to agree with you, but I get it and I agree with you because for my builder clients and developer clients, it's just a math equation. If I have to pay $800,000 an acre to buy an acre of land that's inside the urban growth boundary that's suitable for development, I can build houses on it. And it's going to take me uh, 3 to 4, maybe 5 years to get all my approvals to start actually building that land. So I'm going to have to pay 800,000 an acre. I'm going to have to carry that cost for 3 or 4 or 5 years until I get my approvals. I'm going to have to pray that I can get my approvals and that they're not going to be overturned. Uh, and then I'm going to have to pay, 50, 60, $70,000 per unit to the local government in system development charges to offset the impacts that my housing development is going to have on neighboring streets and the sewer system and water and parks and all of that stuff. Then there's absolutely no way that I can build a home that's affordable to the general public that wants to buy this house. And so the whole concept that we kept telling her, that we kept telling then Representative Kotek and now Governor Kotek, is we can't. We've shorted ourselves land and we've created a process that's so broken that asking the development industry to risk capital on building something in Oregon is just not going to happen as much as you want it to happen because we're in a country where capital flows freely between all 50 states. I can go
Yeah.
over to Arizona and get approval to build a subdivision in Arizona, and it's not going to take me 3 or 4 or 5 years. I get it done in 6 weeks
Yeah.
and sell the houses at a cheaper price. Hell, you can buy a nice house more cheaper in Texas, in Dallas, the Dallas Fort Worth
Yeah.
market, one of the hottest markets in the United States. I can afford a house more cheaply there than I can in Portland, and it's ridiculous. And so
And bigger. I mean, just price per
Yeah.
square foot is just half,
And
really.
so the problem that we're having, Brian, is that we've processed and we artificially shorted our land supply to the point that land is so expensive that you can develop is so expensive that projects don't pencil out. And the process that we've created is long and cumbersome and uncertain. So we have a shortage of developers and builders that are willing to risk their capital to build projects that are really, and developers get a bad name, which really makes me mad because all a developer is somebody that's building a product that the public wants. The
Yeah.
public wants housing. They're building housing. Why is that bad? Uh, uh,
Yeah, that
uh,
is an oddity that developers have gotten this kind of greedy, seedy kind of thing, right? I mean, I don't know if I mean there's I don't know, maybe Donald Trump hasn't helped us in that respect being a developer, but like a housing developer is just I always think because I know a lot of housing developers and most of them were just guys that were swinging hammers that ended up building a 5 lot subdivision, and then they moved up and built a 20 lot subdivision, and then they leveraged everything they own in their entire life, and they did a 50 housing subdivision, and then they became Polish Homes, or they became Hayden Homes, or they became these household names that we know around Oregon, right? That have literally leveraged everything they had in their life just to try to build houses for people. They're not I mean, and they made some good money during some good times, right? But they've also, those guys they were holding on to their hats in '07, '08, '09, and I know for a fact like Polish and some of these other guys that I know, like, I just know them. I know the family and they were everything they had, they put into just try to stay afloat and keep workers hired through that downturn and they barely made it out of there. And now they're doing well again, but not as but they're building in Washington, they're building in Idaho, they're moving to Montana and because they're just finding it a heck of a lot easier. And it's not that they don't want to build in Oregon because they love Oregon, right? They started here, they grew up here, they like you said, they want to invest here. That's that person that can't really move. It's little old Betty that finally goes and, works with the local guy that wants to turn her little 20 acres that, have been in her family forever, but she wants to send her kids to college and do all the things and trying to help them figure out a way to build that 20 acres, which they haven't farmed for 30 years and it's kind of junk land but it's classified farmland,
right.
and is that there's my rant, but is that because now what we're starting to see is a turnaround on the housing. So we kind of cratered out of the 22 was kind of the high end of the retail market. We've seen prices drop the last few years as interest rates have kind of hovered up. We're starting to definitely see Texas, Arizona just passed a 14-day building permit for normal subdivisions like slam bam, thank you, ma'ams. Like, hey, these builders know what they're doing, get out of the way. And we passed Senate Bill 974. You were a huge part of that, with Senator Anderson's office. Obviously, Jody Hack, the governor just signed it, today that we learned. You talked about Governor Kotek. She gets housing, man. She's been fighting us upstream on this housing thing. Uh, since she's become governor. She's been
Well, and the
probably
funny
been
thing,
fighting upstream since she was speaker, to be honest. But
well, and the funny thing on that, Brian, is that she's fighting her own party.
yeah, yeah,
And that's the part that makes me shake my head that the governor's message is pretty simple and entirely accurate. We underbuild by about half the number of houses that we need every year in this state just to house our existing population. We're almost 150,000 units short of the number of housing units that we need just to house our
mhm,
existing population. If Oregon shrinks, then that number will shrink. But if Oregon continues to grow, then then we fall further behind every year that Oregon continues to grow because we're underbuilding. So the government doesn't have the ability or the money to become the state's home builder. They have to rely on the private sector. The
Yeah.
only way that we'll get out of this problem is if they rely on the private sector. We have, on behalf of the private sector, we have been telling the governor and the legislature for years what it is that needs to happen in order to start turning those numbers around. And the legislature is sort of kind of listening, but it's really just sort of kind of, because again, there's a huge split within the majority party between those people that don't care about whether the units actually get built. They're more interested in the process,
Mm,
versus those, what they call the abundance part of the Democratic Party, that's interested in actually seeing results on the ground, meaning we want more housing units. If those folks would join with the Republicans and form a sort of a housing coalition that we can see every now and again. 974 was one where we had a housing coalition. But if they could join together, they could overcome the handful of really, far left progressive Democrats that aren't interested in growing at all and aren't interested in whether or not their kids or grandkids have a future in this state. I'd like to see that happen, not just on the housing side, but on the commercial industrial side too. We don't need, if we don't have jobs, then we don't need housing. So
yeah.
we got to do that too. But the point is, we need to have a coalition of common sense legislators to sit down and say, okay, we're going to sideline the kooks. The kooks on the left, the kooks on the right, and believe me, there are far more kooks on the left. But we're going to sideline those kooks and push them to the side and say, sorry, thanks for your input. Here's a pat on the head. Now go to the little kids' table. Uh, and because we're going to do what needs to be done to make sure that Oregonians have a bright future. We're losing generations. And this is the point I want to make to young folks. We are losing generations. And it's entirely because of the policies that we have in the state that we could easily fix if we had the courage to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And to use your terminology, the kooks on the left. The, do,
And
do they just,
and let me clarify that, Brian. I am not, don't I don't want people to say I'm calling the Democrats kooks. But there are within that party, and the same, and again, the same with the R's, but more on the D side. There
yeah.
are people within those parties that are extremists, and unfortunately, they get traction in the Capitol. And I don't understand why they get traction, because their message is so easily refuted. But it's like I remember a couple of years ago, Brian, a Democrat legislator who was a chair of a committee and is now no longer in the legislature, uh, told me, I agree 100% with what you're saying, and I agree with your solutions, but I cannot vote for that because the environmental community will give me a mark on their scorecard.
Yeah.
Okay, why do we care about that? Well, because then it makes it, they might run a candidate against me in the primary. Well, whatever. I don't know how you get around that.
Yeah, I don't either. I think it's Senator Knope always had a bad mark on his NRA card, like right for the National Rifle Association did the scorecard, and it was only because literally he's never voted against a gun bill, and he told me this, and they scored him because he had a meeting one time with Moms Demand Action, like, and so they scored him against because he had a meeting. And it's like, wow. So you're right. We have them on our side too, right? I mean, it's not, and I think we actually have a pretty, a 974. You can clearly go back and just watch who voted for those bills, and you can see who the people that know that they're getting banged on by their local constituents and people saying, we got to do something about housing because they're when we present a housing bill that says this is going to help us solve this problem we're in. Granted, we're only fixing, geez, my phone. Stupid Washington, D.C. That must be Trump calling. Um,
We better take that one.
no, no, he can wait. I can't go down to LA and solve the riots. Sorry, President Trump. I'm dealing with housing here in Oregon. I think what I get what I get into with that is that we're solving a problem of process within what we've been talking about within this UGB and all these sort of things that we could solve the bigger problem and wouldn't even need Senate Bill 974. Right? If like we're literally trying to create a fix within a fix because of this process that is just grinded everything to the halt. So we're just trying to find some sort of a needle through what are they, trying to weave the yarn through a weird nose of a needle that shouldn't have to be that difficult. But we've made it so difficult that we're now creating legislation to try to make it less difficult for something that shouldn't be so, if that makes sense, what I'm trying to say there, like we're just creating a whole bunch of issues, and now we're trying to, like the governor's bill, she's like, oh, I'm going to go after, middle housing. We're going to stick it in UGB ground that is not developed yet. You can put a quadplex there. Okay. Like we weren't able to do that before? No. Like how have we not able to do that before? That seems crazy.
Well, there's a couple of issues with what you just said, Brian. There is a completely myopic focus with the majority party on infill development. And for your listeners that don't know what infill development is, that's housing in areas where that are already developed for housing. So it's taking a single family house and converting it to a duplex or a triplex, or a neighborhood of single family houses, and tearing down 5 or 6 of them and replacing them with an apartment complex. Density infill. That's there's a focus almost exclusively on infill development, which is fine. We're very supportive of infill development. But what cities are discovering in Oregon is that there is the most urgent need for housing in Oregon is for market rate single family detached housing. In other words, single family homes. Number one, and we've pulled this issue multiple times over the years. That's what both the Republican and Democrat people that respond to these polls, both parties, it's what they want. The dream of your average Oregonian continues to be a single family house on a lot with a yard. The funny difference, Brian, is that Republicans, if given the choice, their dream would be a single family house on a couple of acres in the country where everybody will leave them alone. While the Democrat dream home is a single family detached home in the suburbs. And so while we continue to focus on affordable housing and apartments and things like that, which again we're very supportive of, we continue to short ourselves the housing that both the public really wants and that we really need. And so if we really want to address the housing crisis, we're going to, number one, make the process a lot simpler. And 974 again takes a stab at that. But we need to do so much more. And we need to add more land. We could go from 1% of our land inside urban growth boundaries to 2%, and no one would know the difference, and it would have a huge impact on land prices, which means that we could start building housing that might be affordable to my 28-year-old, 29-year-old oldest son.
Yeah, I've done right. I mean, I kind of did some calculations and I really think like a starter home, 3 bedroom, 2 bath, 1,300 square foot banger, right? With on a 6,000, 7,000 square foot lot should be about 280 grand.
Mhm.
That's about where,
And,
but
and kids can, I call them kids because they're all younger than me. But someone in their 20s, late, mid to late 20s, out of college, has a job, earns a
Mhm.
decent wage, or working a trade.
Yeah,
Uh, you know,
making 50 grand a year, something like that,
yeah,
55, 60,
yeah,
somewhere in there.
yeah, something like that. Should be able to afford one of these, one of those homes.
Hmm.
It's the 1970s ranch style house, that when
Yeah.
I graduated from high school, you got a job. If you didn't go to college, you got a job at the mill, and you could earn enough money to buy a car and buy a home and raise a family. And that, because our average house price is so high now, not only does that mean that they can't that's the average age of first time home buyers is increasing significantly. It's almost 10 years higher than it was 30 years ago. So
Yeah.
people are waiting to buy their first house, not because they want to wait, but because they can't afford it until they're, maybe in their mid 30s.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem. And so it's the price to buy a house has gone way up, but along with the price of buying a house going way up, the price of rents have risen accordingly. And so, my 25-year-old daughter in Hillsborough is paying as much rent on her place as I pay on my mortgage.
Yeah. And then she can't save anything, because all of her money's going to rent. And yeah,
Yeah.
it really is a death spiral, as they say, or a doom loop, because you're just not, you have to be able to save. I mean, heck, even so that same $280,000 house, you look at it in anywhere from Beaverton to Salem, and we'll leave Bend out of the mix, but there, that starter home is now 450 to 600, and based on where it is, right? But it shouldn't be, because that's you have to come up with 100 grand down payment, and how are you gonna? That's gonna take years, and many hours of driving Uber in the evening.
Well,
And,
and Habitat for Humanity has shown, hardly a right-leaning organization.
yeah.
Habitat for Humanity has published multiple articles that have demonstrated that the surest way out of poverty, out of multi-generational poverty, is through homeownership.
Yep.
It's the way that a young person starts to build equity. Instead of paying a landlord rent that goes, the equity
Yeah.
goes to the landlord, you own your home, you start paying it off. Your mortgage balance goes down every month, and hopefully the market stays stable, or home prices rise. And so you start building equity. You take that starter home, you trade that up, you get something a little bit nicer, or you keep that home and buy another one and use that one for a rental or whatever. And you grow your way out of poverty through equity in land ownership,
Yeah.
and we're
That's
losing.
that's what I mean. I grew up in, East, like Sandy, Gresham area, graduated high school in Gresham. My parents were blue collar workers, didn't make any money, but they bought a house in Gresham, and we moved from the mobile home park in Sandy. You just did that continuum of housing, right? Where you just kept moving up, and I always knew, like, my grandma used to always say, buy land, buy buildings, buy things, and Vicky and I paid off our house, so we don't owe anything on our home. And that was probably 4, 5, 6 years ago, something like that. We made the last payment on our house, and then we've seen our net worth, not because of the house, just because all the money I was paying on the house, I now put into my 401k. I now put into my bank account, and so as your earnings go up as you get older in life, as and then you don't have that drag of that house payment because you paid it off. Like it's exponential, and but I'm afraid I'm gonna have to give up all of that to help my kids buy a house.
Well, and yeah, that's right. And
Give them mine.
if you pay rent your entire life, then you don't have you don't have that asset. You don't have that asset to borrow money.
Yeah.
If if you have an emergency, you don't have that asset to sell at some point and reinvest in something else. You just become you just lose out on that opportunity. And so really, our focus at at the Oregon legislature ought to be, how are we going to not just assure that we have housing for the affordable housing for folks that really don't have any opportunity to find a place that they can afford to rent. So they're one step away from homelessness all the time. That's a critical need that we all agree
Yep.
needs to be addressed. But also, how can we make it easier to build market rate single family detached, get those home prices a little bit lower so that the next generation of young people can buy a home and join the homeowner community, and build that generational wealth.
Yeah.
We need
I
to
couldn't
fight for
agree.
that.
We kind of boiled it down. I think this session, what we boiled down housing to three very distinct things, and regulations, which is we talked a lot about today. Infrastructure. So these cities, they got dwindling infrastructure. They got UGB areas that need pump stations, water lines that they just don't have especially in rural Oregon or even areas like Canby, right, where they're growing, but they have these pockets of land that it's just the cost of putting the infrastructure out to those green fields to build homes is just not there. So you have regulations, infrastructure, which we've been this legislature, and I'll give some Democrats and the governor credit on those two things, focusing on getting that. And the third is what we've really talked about a lot too, is land. And until we've with 974, with the governor's 2138 that's coming through with her bill last short session, like all the things we've done on regulation and that infill that we talk about, like that's going to be full. Like I think we have enough stuff in there now and then now we need some more infrastructure. I believe we need some more infrastructure investments in these cities. We need to get rid of, in our press release, I'll put it in the show notes, but we put out a Senate Republican press release on housing and on these three buckets. And we said we need to get rid of the lift money. We've spent over $1 billion in trying to build affordable housing, and all we did is take all of the market rate developers and made them affordable housing developers. And they're just getting a free handout. And why wouldn't you, right? They're just business owners too. But we need to put $500 million into the ground, into assets in these fast growing communities that would unlock the Senate Bill 974, the 21, all the other ground that's out there in the UGB. And then in the short session, Dave, we need to come back with some land stuff, because we're going to have land, and I hope we get there, because then I think we can see ourselves grow at a nice pace that gets us back to that. Maybe it's not '05, maybe it's like that 2000 level of home building, where we're kind of hitting that 25 to 28,000 number. We're not quite getting to what Governor Kotek wants at the 35 number, but we're at least not in a doom loop, you know.
Well, and just understand, for the people listening to this, that just understand we have lots of small Oregon companies that do building, and I love all of them. But where you're really going to make up numbers on the building side, at least on the residential building side, is through the national companies. And Oregon has a lot of national companies that build in all 50 states. We have a lot of those in Oregon. Those are the production builders. The production builders are really the ones that are going to drive
Yeah.
units. And when you have production builders that build across the United States, they build where where their capital risk is the lowest. And so if we don't give them and our locals, all of our builders, our local builders and our national production builders, if we don't give those folks enough dirt to develop, uh, and we artificially short ourselves so that the dirt we do have to develop is so expensive that we'll never build an affordable product, then we're not going to get our way. We're not going to be able to solve this problem. We need more dirt. And that's a hard conversation for the majority party to have because they don't know the statistics, they don't know the numbers, and they're swayed by arguments about sprawl. But
Yeah,
again,
sure.
we could double our UGBs from 1% to 2%, and no one would know the difference, and it would have a huge impact on land prices and housing prices.
Well, we'll do our best to get that message out there, I think, to them. I don't know if we're going to get there by the short session, but maybe. I don't, maybe we have to crater, maybe we have to hit rock bottom, but you're right. Like we got to have the Pulte's, we got to have because DR Horton's been building in Oregon and they do okay. But like you said, you really need those national home builders, but they can't come in and develop 15 acres. They need to come in and develop like 200 acres.
They're not doing your infill projects where they're taking out, they're taking out a home and putting in a cottage cluster. They're
Yeah.
not doing that. They do what's called greenfield development, where they take land that's never been developed, run it through the entitlement process, through the local process, so they design it all for streets and sewers and parks and all the amenities that make for a really nice subdivision. And then they go in and they build, 300 or 400 units. They're not talking about building 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And we love, again, I love anyone that risks capital in Oregon, anyone, whether they're from Oregon or from outside Oregon. If you're willing to come into this state and risk capital, you have my organization's 100% support. But but we just know that in order to meet those targets that the governor has set, which are really ambitious, they're what we need, but they're really ambitious. We're going to rely on a lot of production building to make that happen.
Yeah. Hey, one last question, I'll let you go. You said a little bit about rural housing, and I just wanted to get what if we took the 2 acre minimum and reduced it to 1 acre? Would that make a huge effect, do you
Absolutely.
think?
And again, yeah, what you're talking about, Brian, is the interesting thing is because they seem like terms that don't fit together, is rural infill, where we take a rural residential area,
Uh-huh.
a house on 2 acres, uh, and we allow that. Instead of requiring a 2 acre minimum, we allow the owners of the property in there to go to a 1 acre minimum, where they, instead of having one house on 2 acres, they could put two houses,
Yeah.
2 acre parcel. You're not going to generate a ton of units, but there is an absolute market demand for that. And so the units that you will produce will be very valuable because again, what people really long for that they can't get anymore in this state is a house with a yard.
Hmm.
The only way you can get a house with a yard these days is to go in and buy a house that was built in, 1920, 1930, where they still built houses on 5,000 square foot lots or 7,500 square foot lots, where you could buy a house with a yard. Uh, there's no shortage of people that want that kind of house, and they can get it in a rural area. If so, we could unlock some pretty significant development if we would do some rural infill. It's not going to impact farm and forest. And I think it's a win-win. The climate activists don't like it because it'll encourage people to drive their cars. On the other hand, the climate activists are a fraction of 1% of the population. And again, going back to our polling, if you tell somebody you have a choice between a condo in the Pearl or a nice home on an acre just outside of Newburgh, I can tell you what the majority of the people polled are going to choose, and it ain't going to be the condo in the Pearl.
Yeah, right. Yeah, very few would. I think they all want that. That's still that stigma that sits with us. I don't care where you go in America. It's not an Oregon thing. It's not, relative to the West Coast or the East Coast. At the end of the day, most Americans want a piece of land, white picket fence or whatever, a little fence around it. They want the backyard where they throw the football with the kid, hit a soccer ball with the girl, maybe a pool. Like, because our home is our castle. Like that is where and no castle was in a condo.
It crosses
know?
it crosses party lines, Brian.
Yeah.
It crosses ethnic, racial barriers.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It's what the majority of Americans want.
Yeah.
And as much as some of our more activist organizations that seem to grab attention from the majority party, try and demand, you can tell people how they're going to live, but if it's not the way they want to live, you're not going to sell the product, and so no one's going to develop it.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen. I'm with you. Well, let's leave it there. Let's to be continued because I didn't get into my golf course homes. I didn't get into. We'll have more. Hopefully, we're done seeing stuff out of housing, at least for this session. I don't, there's a little rent control thing, but you and I both hate rent control, so who cares? It's not going to solve any problem or anything. So it's just a silly, feel-good political bill that does nothing, and everybody that's ever had rent control has done away with it. So. Oregon.
Here's the logic behind that, Brian. Hey, we need more landlords, so we want you to come into Oregon and invest your capital and become a landlord. But hey, if you're a landlord, we're going to pass all this legislation that basically makes it impossible for you to be a landlord.
Yeah.
Do you still want to come here and invest?
Yeah.
And then they wonder why nobody wants to be a landlord.
Interest rates, 30-year interest rates are like 6.5%, and they only want to let us raise 6%.
Yeah.
Rent. So we're supposed to lose 0.5% a year to invest your capital in Oregon? Yeah, I think I'll go anywhere else, any of the other 49 states.
Yeah.
And you'd make more money.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Your wisdom is beyond your years.
Let's talk next time, Brian, about farmers and how we keep farmers farming in Oregon.
Yeah, that sounds good.
The other side, another issue, but equally important.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Dave.
All right.
Walking down these marble halls today, got a bill I wanna make its way. People talking left and right, but we're gonna do this thing tonight. Yeah, time to make a move, can't afford to lose, got the votes to prove what we're gonna do. We're dancing back and forth on the Senate floor, yeah. Moving bills through an open door, round and round until we score. This is what we came here for, dancing on the Senate floor. Representatives and senators meet, trading words to find the perfect beat. Committee hearings all day long, till we finally sing the same song. Oh, yeah. Amendments flying high, watch the We're dancing